For every man who rises to power, there are shadows behind the throne, women whose names history forgets, but whose lives bear the weight of his rise and fall. Close quote. This is the story of Idi Amin Dada's wives, the women who shared his throne, his fame, his fears, and his downfall. The Giant and His Women. Idi Amin Dada, Uganda's most infamous ruler, was not only known for his brutality, his eccentric humour, and his unpredictable politics, he was equally famous for his appetite for women. By the time his government collapsed in April 1979, Idi Amin had 5 official wives and over 40 known children. He called himself the father of the nation, and in a way he nearly was. His marriages were not just personal unions. Each wife represented a different part of Uganda's social and ethnic fabric: Busoga, West Nile, Lango, Buganda, almost as if Amin had built a miniature version of his country within his own household. But power, like love, has a strange way of fading. When his rule fell apart, so too did the empire of women he had built around himself. Malyamu Amin, the first lady from Busoga. She was tall, graceful, and confident. Malyamu Kibedi, the daughter of a respected headmaster and sister to Wanumi Kibedi, who would later become Amin's own foreign minister. Amin first met Malyamu in 1953, long before he became a president, back when he was still a soldier, a boxing champion, charming and muscular, with a booming laugh that filled every room. For years, their relationship remained informal. It wasn't until 1966 that Amin officially married her, the year he began to rise within Uganda's army under President Milton Obote. Malyamu became the first lady of Uganda when Amin seized power in 1971. She was often seen beside him at national events, dressed elegantly, smiling for cameras. People described her as quiet but commanding, aware of her place, but cautious of the man she had married. Behind closed doors, however, life was far less glamorous. Amin was a jealous husband, unpredictable in mood. When Malyamu's brother, Foreign Minister Wanumi Kibedi, defected and denounced Amin's killings at the United Nations, everything changed. In 1973, Amin divorced Malyamu. The break was political, not just personal. Her brother's betrayal meant she was now considered disloyal by association. A year later, in 1974, tragedy struck. Malyamu was reportedly involved in a suspicious car accident that left her with broken limbs. She fled Uganda soon after, fearing for her life, never to return. Her love story with Amin had begun with laughter and ended in fear. She would later live in exile, away from the man she once called husband, far from the country where her brother's name had condemned her. Ha! Kay Adroa, the beauty from Arua. If Malyamu represented elegance, Kay Adroa embodied innocence. She was the daughter of Reverend Adroa, a respected Christian leader in Arua. Amin himself from West Nile had always wanted a wife from his homeland. When he met Kay, a beautiful Makerere University student, he was enchanted. They married in 1966 in a civil ceremony, not in church, for Kay was Christian and Amin was Muslim. Yet the wedding was celebrated across Kampala, a show of modernity, unity, and pride. For a while, Kay lived in comfort. She had drivers, bodyguards, and staff. She represented a new kind of Ugandan woman, educated, poised, and refined. But Amin's affection was as volatile as his temper. Rumours of infidelity, politics, and paranoia crept in. In 1973, Amin abruptly announced that he was divorcing her. Then came the shocking part. In 1974, Kay was found dead under mysterious circumstances in a Kampala clinic. Her body had been mutilated, and, in a chilling act, Amin reportedly brought their children to see the remains. Officially, no investigation followed. The dictator's word was law. To the world, Kay Adroa had simply passed away. To those who knew her, she had become one more ghost in Amin's long shadow. Nora Amin, the forgotten wife. Few people remember Nora, Amin's third wife. She came from the Lango region, a land known for its beauty and its proud women. Nora became Amin's wife in 1967, when his power was climbing rapidly through the military ranks. She was quiet, modest, and deeply traditional, the opposite of the loud, flashy personality of her husband. But Nora's marriage was short-lived. By 1973, the same year Amin discarded Malyamu and Kay, he also divorced Nora. The reason was never clear. Some claimed jealousy, others politics. What is known is that after her divorce, Nora disappeared from public life. Like many who had crossed Amin, she faded into silence, her story buried by fear. Madina Amin, the dancer who became a queen. Then came Madina Najemba, the fourth wife, the woman who could move mountains with her dance. She was from Buganda, and before she became First Lady No. 4, she was known as a stunning performer with the traditional troupe Heartbeat of Africa. Her movements, her rhythm, and her confidence captivated audiences, and one day they captivated Idi Amin himself. In 1972, the dictator saw her perform. Within weeks, she was living in State House. Madina was young, beautiful, and Muslim, a combination that pleased Amin, who often said he wanted a wife from every region of Uganda. Madina became a national celebrity, appearing at state events, smiling beside her husband, and often performing privately for visiting dignitaries. But life in Amin's palace was not easy. The other wives grew jealous. Surveillance was constant. The walls had ears. Yet Madina remained loyal, perhaps more than any of the others. When Amin fled Uganda in 1979, she was one of the few who followed him into exile. She later moved to Paris, then Zaire, where her son Abdul Nasser Mwanga was raised with support from President Mobutu Sese Seko. When Amin fell sick in 2003, it was Madina who travelled to Saudi Arabia to care for him in his final days. Even decades after his fall, she still called him Big Daddy. Sarah Kyolaba, the suicide Sarah of Uganda. And then there was Sarah Kyolaba, the most famous and perhaps the most tragic of Amin's wives. Known as Suicide Sarah, she had been a dancer with the Revolutionary Suicide Mechanized Regiment Band, the official army music troupe. Her nickname came from the wild, daring nature of her performances. When Amin saw her dance in the early 1970s, he was mesmerized. Sarah, however, was already in love with a young man from Masaka. On Christmas Day 1974, she gave birth to a baby boy fathered by her boyfriend. Amin, determined to claim her, went on national radio and declared the child his own. The boyfriend vanished soon after. A year later, during the OAU summit of 1975, Amin married Sarah officially. The wedding was grand, attended by African leaders, dignitaries, and foreign journalists. She was radiant, barely in her 20s, standing beside a man more than twice her age. Sarah remained with Amin through the chaos of his rule, even after his downfall. But exile changed her. In 1982, tired of isolation and control, Sarah fled Saudi Arabia with her 3 children. She first went to Germany, where she worked briefly as a model, then later moved to the United Kingdom, where she opened a restaurant and hair salon. In an interview years later, she said, open quote, "People think he was a monster, but to me, he was kind and funny. He loved children. I saw a side of him the world never saw." Close quote. Sarah's life was a strange mirror of Amin's, full of fame, exile, and reinvention. The radio divorce of 1974. The world gasped in 1974 when Idi Amin made one of the strangest announcements in African political history. In a pre-recorded broadcast on Radio Uganda, the president's booming voice declared, open quote, "I, Field Marshal Idi Amin Dada, hereby divorce thee." Close quote. With those words, 3 of his wives, Malyamu, Kay, and Nora, were officially divorced over the airwaves. No warning, no paperwork, no ceremony. He accused them of engaging in business without permission, and bizarrely claimed that one of them, Kay Adroa, had turned out to be his cousin. It was humiliation broadcast to the nation. Overnight, the First Ladies became outcasts, stripped of protection, status, and safety. Some fled, some were silenced, some died. Amin, meanwhile, carried on, his palace filled with dancers, soldiers, and the scent of power that blinded him to the emptiness growing around him. After the fall, when the queens scattered, when Amin's empire finally collapsed in 1979, his wives, once the jewels of the presidential palace, became refugees overnight. The fall of Kampala was chaos. Tanks rumbled through the streets, soldiers deserted, looters filled the markets, and Amin's household scattered like birds escaping fire. Madina Najemba followed Amin into exile, first to Libya, then to Zaire. Sarah Kyolaba fled later, taking her children and seeking freedom. Zamzam Nabirie, who had been close to Amin during his final flight, stayed briefly in Zaire, then returned to Uganda to rejoin the police. Sawia Leila Nasali, a young Ugandan woman Amin married in the early 1980s in Jeddah, tried to restore some normalcy in exile, but by then the power, the wealth, and the illusion of empire were gone. Each wife became a different kind of survivor. Sarah rebuilt her life in the UK, speaking occasionally to the press. Madina lived quietly in Kinshasa. Others, like Malyamu and Nora, slipped into history, their names mentioned only in whispers. A lonely king in exile. In Saudi Arabia, Amin's domestic life grew emptier by the year. His grand house in Jeddah was quiet. Gone were the musicians, the guards, the lavish parties. In their place were the sounds of prayer, the ticking of clocks, and the occasional phone call from a distant child. He missed his wives, even the ones he had divorced, even the ones who had defied him. He sometimes told visitors that he wished they could all live together again as one family, like the old days in Kampala. But those days were gone. Most of his children were scattered across Kenya, Uganda, Europe, and the Middle East. Some visited occasionally. Others avoided him altogether, haunted by the weight of his name. By the 1990s, Amin was no longer the powerful general. He was an aging exile, surrounded by memories of women who had once called him husband, but who had all, in one way or another, left him behind. Epilogue: Love, Power, and Loss. Idi Amin's story is often told through the lens of violence and politics. The executions, the disappearances, the fear. But behind that story is another, quieter tragedy. The story of love lost to power. Each of his wives entered his life full of hope, glamour, and dreams. Each one left, or was forced to leave, with pain, silence, or exile. In a sense, their lives mirrored Uganda's own journey, from beauty to chaos, from promise to ruin. When Amin died in 2003, only Madina was by his side. The others were continents away, living quiet lives, far from the shadow of the man who had once called himself Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. The women who once ruled Uganda's state house now lived as mothers, widows, and businesswomen, each carrying a story history almost forgot. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson, that even the most feared man in Africa could not control the hearts of the women who once loved him. They were not just first ladies. They were survivors, witnesses to power, pain, and the long, lonely exile of a man who lost everything, including them.